And what's the impact of relativism? Like, one thing I had disdain for in university, I found there's this, it's very expedient for professors not to believe in kind of one external, empirically verifiable truth. That there's this, especially in the social sciences, there's this kind of prevailing ethos that, of subjectivism. And that has an impact in allowing many professors to kind of bury their heads in the sand and shy away from offering critiques of power. I mean, sociology in the 60s and before was kind of Marxist, and it was characterized by people challenging power. That's why it was heavily attacked by the FBI and other intelligence agencies, because it was a threat to capitalism. But I found my experience as a sociology student in university was that this kind of postmodern, wishy-washy kind of relativism was embraced, which actually detracted from professors' ability to challenge power. And often I found professors did very well in their careers and attained a lot of funding from studying what I would call trivial issues, when we're living in this era, of course, where Western governments are engaged in a genocide in the Middle East, where the polarization between rich and poor is becoming more egregious. And yet professors invariably, I found them studying very trivial phenomena that was obviously very good for their careers. Could you sort of speak to the philosophical underpinnings that are allowing professors to get away with so many crimes these days?
I have to say that I don't agree with the main premise that you're putting forward. I don't agree that it's the wishy-washy ideology or philosophy that's allowing professors to be irrelevant. Instead, the wishy-washy ideology and philosophy and so on is constructed in order to justify professors being irrelevant, because they want to be irrelevant, because they've been made to understand that they will not have a job unless they obey. That was the real battle. If you look at the last time when professors actually stood for things, it was back in the 30s, 40s, 50s, up to maybe the 60s, where it really meant something to be a professor. You could be politically engaged, you could actually address real questions, and there was a real struggle, and there was a fight. And the corporations, the university corporations in North America won that struggle. They won it. They used tenure and the tenure track and the promotional system as a tool of coercion, and they made it, they brutally fired and suppressed the profs who were standing up at the time. They just went after them. And so they made it clear to the burgeoning professional associations of professors and so on that the power would not put up with true dissidence. And so if your role was to make your members understand that you can have tenure, you can have promotion, you can have good working conditions and salaries and everything, but there's a line you must never cross. You must stay in the realm of ideas. You must not become relevant to society. And this was a very clear message, and it was very well understood by the professorial profession. And there's actually a brilliant historical account of that that's written by, it's in a book called No Ivory Tower, by, now I'm forgetting the author's name, Helen Schrecker, I think it is. I have the book here beside me if you want me to give you the precise name. But the history of that is thanks to Helen and other researchers, is well understood. So to become a university professor, you have to go through this process. And, well, first you go through the first levels of indoctrination, which are undergraduate, graduate, professional school. And then you go through a further layer, which is the tenure track. By the time you're through that, if you're given tenure is a certificate that says you will never use it. You'll never use tenure. That's what tenure is. It's a guarantee that this person will never oppose the system.
Because because that professor has had to genuflect to people above them. You know, usually it's like a handful of colleagues who are deciding their fate. And so if those in the higher echelons of the institution have been perpetuating myths, then the lower down professors have to prescribe to those myths in order to get patted on the back by those above them. Is that pretty much what happens?
No, it's actually much more powerful than that, Joshua. It's much more incisive, and it goes to the heart of the person. It works like this. You see, under the tenure track regime, you have to self-regulate yourself, because if you personally, as an individual, make one mistake, you're out. There's a good chance you're out. You will not get tenure. So you're not depending on your colleagues telling you what to do. It's self-indoctrination. Self-indoctrination. You have to agree to change your own personality. You have to agree to purify yourself by finding and guessing the mind of your colleagues in your profession to the point where you will never oppose them. And that becomes part of you. So it's a very vicious attack on your own person. Unless, of course, you were brought up in a family. If your parents were university professors, then you were facilitated into that. But if you're someone like myself who comes from a working class background, it's an attack on your own person. I mean, what I went through and what I put myself through was absolutely vicious, because I had to go against my heart, my convictions, my knowledge of what was needed versus what was expected from the professorial class, you see. So it's more powerful than just group pressure. It's forcing the person to confirm through a self-indoctrination.
One thing I really admired about you, Professor Rancourt, is that all through your debacle, which we'll expound more momentarily, is that you've been posting everything on a blog on the internet, and it strikes me there's a kind of crisis in the university system now since the advent of the internet, because the university used to be a kind of fountain of knowledge. They used to have a kind of monopoly on discourse. But now students can just Google things and try to verify the claims of their professors. And one way you, I think, have been able to circumvent this whole monopoly on a certain form of knowledge, a certain form of discourse, is by embracing the internet, as we're doing right now. And so do you think that the internet has caused a kind of crisis for universities, because basically their myths and their lies are more easily exposed, and often students have got their ear to the ground and are actually often closer to unmasking truth than the professoriate, who, as you're suggesting, are having to often self-censor themselves?
The internet, my blog, which is called U of O Watch, so it's directly critical of the institutions, of the university itself where I work, is a big concern to the university, because I'm exposing things that directly relate to the university. And it's having a large impact, but it's not having a direct impact in terms of education or changing people's minds or anything like that. It's more a place where people can go and discover things. So, for example, recently there was a dean of a faculty at the University of Ottawa who was not very liked at all, and who was actually quite a brutal, somewhat of a dictator, and who had fired various people and had been quite harsh with students and so on. And she decided that she wanted to have a promotion, and so she applied to be president of another university. And that process was public, the process of selection of the president at this other university. So the first thing the students and various researchers did at that other university was to Google this person's name. And on the first page of the Google search result was an article about her from my blog. And so they immediately went to that, and they read some pretty harsh things that had been said about her. And this, in the long run, brought her from being the first contender to not getting the job. Now that's serious. That is for a blog to have that kind of influence, to potentially punish administrators in terms of their reputation and in terms of what people know about them because of their behavior as administrators, is a powerful tool. And so it limits the careers of these people who tend to move around otherwise. And it makes them accountable. And I think that's one of the most powerful things that this blog does. In terms of the students being able to be made more conscious by this kind of information, I don't see much evidence of that. I mean, students are asleep the same way that professors are asleep. I mean, we're all asleep. And no amount of information, as far as I can see, is going to change that. The only thing that can change that is personal interaction. If I'm upset and I see something that I think is a violation of basic principles of justice and so on, and I make a point of reaching out and telling people that this is wrong and we need to change it, if I make that personal effort, then I will be able to reach a handful of people who in turn will be able to reach others. But I see very little, personally, I see very little value in the activism done through the internet. I think it's an encouragement. I think it's a networking tool. But in terms of actual agency and actually causing a revolution, I don't see it. I don't see it. I mean, I see it, sure, a communication tool, a facilitator to get people to organize certain things, but those certain things have to be real. And so until that starts to happen, I don't think anything's going to happen in Canada.
I think that's what we might have seen with Occupy, where there was obviously there's this internet dimension to activism these days, where we're sharing ideas and interacting with one another. You're in Ottawa, I'm in Calgary, we're many thousands of miles apart from each other. But with Occupy, people actually came to their public squares and got to know one another kind of in person. And so I hope that there is that symbiotic relationship with internet networking, which is so vital, and sharing knowledge, sharing, when people, if you think of the kind of We Are Change movement in the 9/11 truth movement, where you see people going and challenging Rudy Giuliani on camera, and they can put it on YouTube, and suddenly thousands of people around the world have seen it. But I agree with you, there has to be this practical dimension where people actually gather in their kind of human, because there's a kind of online Denis Rancourt and an online Joshua Blakeney that people in Zimbabwe and Australia and wherever can watch. But there's also the tangible human who needs to come out into their public squares and engage in civil activism. I agree with you on that point.
Well, any kind of activism that is essentially a social event is not activism. It's not going to create revolution. It's not going to create significant change. It's not going to create leverage that will allow us to gain things from the power structure. So if it's an Occupy like it was in Ottawa of a park, yes, there's an activism component if actual homeless street people are taking land and are, setting up shop and kitchens and everything. That component is real activism. But the component of just the social event is not. It's social networking. That's what it is. There's nothing wrong with that. You need it, but it's not activism in itself. You would have to go and block the entrance to major banks. You would have to go and block the entrance to the parliament. You would have to go, as you say in the truth movement, when you actually put your body out there to go and interview someone and expose them and ask them embarrassing questions on camera, yeah, that's activism. But getting the truth out, I don't think is activism. Telling people this is what you have to conclude from this information, I don't personally, I know this is going to make a lot of people angry, but personally I don't see that